The exact second the GPS map glitched into a series of distorted human faces and the rental car's headlights illuminated a tall, faceless silhouette standing completely motionless in the middle of the foggy Tennessee mountain road, I knew my solo weekend getaway had transformed into a living nightmare. My name is Colton Briggs, and I had planned a quiet 4-day vacation in a secluded cabin rental tucked deep within the dense, dark woods just outside of Gatlinburg, hoping to escape the exhausting stress of my corporate job in Atlanta. But what I actually encountered in those ancient, whispering mountains was an ancient, malevolent force that almost cost me my life and my sanity. The drive up into the mountains had been unnerving from the start, with the winding roads growing narrower and the modern world fading away into an absolute wall of black timber. It was roughly 11:45 p.m. on a freezing, overcast Friday night when I finally reached the property, a beautiful yet unsettlingly dark 2-story log cabin surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to lean inward, completely blocking out what little moonlight managed to pierce through the heavy storm clouds above. The gravel driveway crunched loudly under my tires, a sound that felt inappropriately loud in the oppressive silence of the deep forest. As soon as I turned off the engine, the sudden lack of sound pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, leaving only the faint, distant whistle of the wind through the high canopy. The cabin itself possessed an eerie, suffocating atmosphere the moment I stepped across the creaking wooden threshold, the interior smelling intensely of damp earth, old paper, and a faint, sickening trace of copper that instantly made my stomach churn with an inexplicable sense of dread. I remember standing in the small entryway, fumbling for the light switch, my fingers trembling slightly for reasons I couldn't quite explain at the time. When the overhead lights finally flickered on, they cast long, dancing shadows across the rustic living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. After unpacking my few bags in the dim, shadow-drenched living room, I decided to pour myself a glass of water and try to relax on the old leather sofa. But the sudden, violent drop in temperature inside the house was so severe that my breath instantly began to plume into thick white clouds of mist right before my eyes. The chill didn't just touch my skin. It felt as though it was radiating from the very bones of the building, settling deep into my chest. That was when the first true supernatural anomaly occurred. An old, ornate grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining area, which had been completely broken and missing its pendulum according to the rental listing, suddenly burst to life with a violent shudder. Its heavy metal gears began grinding with a deafening, metallic screech as the rusted hands began spinning violently backward at an impossible speed, the ticking sound morphing into something that sounded dangerously like a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. I froze in absolute confusion, my heart beginning to slam against my ribs like a trapped bird, when a low, wet scratching sound began echoing from the inside of the wooden walls, moving rapidly from the floorboards beneath my feet, up through the drywall, and directly onto the ceiling right above where I stood paralyzed with fear. It sounded like dozens of long, sharp fingernails dragging against the raw wood, desperately trying to find a way out or a way in. Terrified, I reached into my pocket for my smartphone to call the property owner or the local sheriff, desperate for any connection to the outside world. But the screen was displaying nothing but a chaotic, flickering cascade of corrupted green code, and a distorted, weeping human voice began to faintly broadcast directly through the phone's internal speaker. The sound was horribly clear despite the static, sobbing uncontrollably before repeating my name, Colton, over and over in a desperate, panicked whisper that sounded exactly like it was coming from someone standing right behind me. Before I could even drop the glitch device from my trembling hand, every single light bulb in the cabin exploded simultaneously in a sharp shower of sparks and shattered glass, plunging me into absolute, blinding darkness save for the dim, sickly gray light filtering through the high windows from the stormy woods outside. In the pitch-black silence that followed, the air grew incredibly thick, making it painful to breathe as the distinct smell of ozone and rotting would fill the room. The heavy cloth curtains separating the living room from the dark hallway began to rustle violently, as if caught in a localized gale force wind, snapping back and forth against the wooden frame. Slowly, a tall, emaciated entity woven entirely out of shifting, translucent black shadows materialized from the darkness of the hall, its elongated, multi-jointed limbs moving with an unnatural, glitchy motion as it stepped into the room. It didn't walk so much as float, its silhouette tearing at the edges of reality like ink bleeding into water. The absolute horror of the situation hit my brain when the creature's face slowly shifted, splitting open in a wide, vertical tear to reveal a massive, featureless void that began to mimic the exact voice of my mother, begging me to come closer into the dark because she was so cold and alone in the woods. The emotional manipulation was devastating, sending a shockwave of psychological terror through my system. Tears of sheer terror stung my eyes as I realized the trap I was in. I stumbled backward in the dark, my heel catching on the edge of the heavy oak coffee table, sending me falling hard onto the cold floorboards. The shadow entity lunged forward with impossible speed, its freezing, spectral hands reaching out to wrap around my throat to choke the life out of me. The air was completely sucked from my lungs as the entity's touch burned my skin like dry ice, a freezing numbness spreading rapidly down my chest and paralyzing my limbs. My vision began to narrow into a pinprick of blackness, the mocking voice of the creature laughing directly into my mind. Through a final, desperate surge of survival instinct, my flailing hand brushed against a heavy iron fireplace poker resting by the hearth beside me. Grabbing it with the last of my fading strength, I swung it wildly through the dark, feeling the solid metal pass through the creature like cold smoke, but the impact caused it to unleash a high-pitched, deafening frequency that literally shattered the remaining window panes in the living room. The momentary distraction broke its physical grip on my throat, allowing me to draw a ragged, painful breath. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my chest, and threw myself recklessly through the now broken window frame, tumbling out onto the sharp rocks and damp dirt of the forest floor outside. Bleeding from numerous small cuts and hyperventilating in total panic, I ran blindly through the pitch-black woods, my boots slipping on wet leaves as I tore through the brush toward where I thought the main road lay. I didn't care about my belongings, my car, or my phone. My entire universe had shrunk down to the desperate need to run. Every shadow between the trees looked like the long-limbed creature, and the whispers seemed to follow me through the rustling canopy. I ran for nearly 2 agonizing hours through the freezing rain, my muscles screaming in exhaustion, until I finally collapsed on the muddy shoulder of Route 321, barely conscious. A passing park ranger truck spotted my reflective jacket in the headlights, finding me shivering, incoherent, and suffering from severe hypothermia. When the local authorities went to investigate the cabin the next afternoon based on my wild story, they found the property entirely abandoned, boarded up, and overgrown with thick briars as if no one had stepped foot inside for 50 years. The local records indicated the cabin had been condemned decades ago after a family vanished without a trace inside it. However, right in the center of the ruined, dust-covered living room floor sat my rental car keys and my smartphone. Its screen completely melted into a puddle of plastic, surrounded by a perfect, unmelting circle of thick, black frost that defied the warm afternoon sun. I never went back to Tennessee, and to this day, I can't look at a smartphone screen glitching without feeling a freezing hand tightening around my throat. I woke up to a freezing blast of wind inside my locked motel room and the bone-chilling sight of a decaying hand slowly emerging directly out of the smooth glass surface of the vanity mirror, its rotting fingers reaching out to grab my throat as I lay completely paralyzed on the bed. My name is Sterling Vance, and during a solo cross-country road trip along the historic Route 66 through the desolate landscapes of New Mexico, I encountered a spatial nightmare that forever shattered my belief in the laws of physics and reality. The day had been long and exhausting, driving through endless miles of flat desert under a baking sun that eventually gave way to a violent, purple-hued twilight storm. It was a miserable, stormy Thursday night around 2:15 a.m. when my car's alternator began to fail, the dashboard lights flickering wildly before dying completely, forcing me to pull off the empty highway into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a flickering, dilapidated motel called the Neon Oasis, which looked like it hadn't been renovated since the late 1970s. The neon sign buzzed with a low, electrical hum that sounded like swarming insects, casting a sickening green glow over the entire property. The air outside felt static and dead, and the endless desert surrounding the motel seemed to swallow any sense of safety. The elderly clerk at the front desk had a pale, vacant stare and didn't say a single word as he handed me the rusted brass key to room 14, his skin feeling entirely devoid of body heat when our fingers accidentally brushed against each other during the transaction. His eyes didn't even seem to blink, tracking my movements with a hollow, robotic intensity. I hurried across the dark, windswept balcony to my room, locking the deadbolt and chain immediately, exhausted from 12 hours of driving and eager to get some sleep before the storm got any worse outside. The room was incredibly outdated, featuring old shag carpeting and a large, ornate vanity mirror mounted on the wall, directly opposite the creaking queen-sized bed, reflecting the dim green glow of the buzzing neon sign outside the window. I fell asleep almost instantly, but my consciousness was violently ripped back to reality hours later by a sudden, unnatural silence that felt as though the entire room had been placed inside a vacuum, followed by the terrifying realization that I was experiencing a severe episode of sleep paralysis, unable to move a single muscle or even scream for help. Panic surged through my veins as I tried to force my fingers to move, but my body felt like it was encased in solid concrete. That was when I noticed the mirror. The reflection inside the glass didn't show my current room, but rather a pitch-black, decaying version of the exact same space, covered in thick cobwebs, rotting wood, and the skeletal remains of someone sitting perfectly upright in the corner armchair. My eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the skeletal figure in the mirror slowly turned its hollow skull toward me, its jaw dropping open in a silent, mocking scream as it began to crawl forward, transitioning effortlessly from the reflection directly into my physical reality by pushing its arms straight through the solid glass, as if it were liquid water. The glass rippled like a dark pond as the entity's freezing, emaciated hands gripped the wooden frame of the mirror, pulling its horrific, decaying torso out into the room while a foul, suffocating stench of sulfur and old graves flooded my senses, choking the air from my lungs. The supernatural entity glided across the carpet without making a single sound, its featureless, hollow eye sockets locked onto mine as it leaned over the bed, its freezing breath smelling of rot as it wrapped its skeletal fingers tightly around my neck, cutting off my airway entirely. I could feel the sharp, icy pressure of its bones digging into my windpipe, the intense cold radiating from its hands, threatening to freeze the blood in my veins. Through pure adrenaline-fueled desperation, the mental barrier of my paralysis finally snapped, allowing me to violently throw myself off the side of the bed, dragging the entity down with me as we crashed onto the hard floorboards in a chaotic struggle. The moment I hit the ground, the entity vanished in a thin air, leaving behind nothing but a freezing cold residue on my skin. But the true horror was far from over, because when I looked up, I realized the room's layout had completely inverted, and the door to the outside highway was completely gone, replaced by solid, seamless concrete walls that seemed to be slowly closing in on me. The window was gone too, leaving me sealed inside a windowless, doorless tomb. The neon sign outside the window was now flashing a deep blood-red color through some invisible source, and the digital alarm clock on the nightstand began ticking backward at a frantic pace, the numbers changing into bizarre, alien symbols that glowed with a sickening luminescence. The air was running out quickly, growing hotter and harder to breathe by the second. I scrambled toward the vanity mirror, realizing it was now the only object left in the room that showed the original, normal version of room 14. In a state of absolute panic, I grabbed the heavy ceramic base of the bedside lamp and slammed it hard against the glass with all my remaining strength. The mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces with a deafening crash, and a violent, rushing vortex of wind immediately erupted from the broken shards, pulling me forward into the blinding white light that poured out from the wall. The suction was immense, tearing at my clothes and hair as I was dragged through the temporal rift. I lost consciousness instantly, and when my eyes finally fluttered open, I was lying face down in the middle of the empty, rain-slicked Route 66 highway at dawn, my car parked perfectly on the shoulder, just 50 yards away with the engine idling smoothly, as if nothing had happened. I staggered to my feet, bruised, bleeding, and deeply traumatized, looking back toward where the motel should have been, only to find nothing but a vast, empty expanse of desert sand and a rusted, bullet-ridden sign from a business that had burned down to the ground in 1982. The local sheriff's office later told me that dozens of travelers had gone missing along that exact stretch of highway over the last 40 years, with no cars or bodies ever recovered. To this day, I still bear 5 faint, symmetrical white scars wrapped around my throat where the entity gripped me, a permanent, terrifying reminder that some travel destinations exist entirely outside the realm of the living, waiting to snare unsuspecting drivers who pull off the road in the dead of night. The absolute terrifying moment my compass began spinning violently in reverse, and the dense fog lifted to reveal the exact same rusted, abandoned 1970s camper that I had walked away from 3 hours ago, now sitting perfectly in the center of my secluded campsite with its rusted door slowly swinging open on its own. I realized something ancient and malevolent had trapped me in the forest. My name is Maverick Cole, and this unexplainable paranormal encounter took place during a solo backpacking trip through the most isolated, deep wilderness sectors of Olympic National Park in Washington State, a place where the trees are so dense that the sun barely touches the forest floor even at noon. I had hiked over 15 miles off the grid into the backcountry, looking for absolute solitude to photograph the pristine landscape, setting up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering old-growth cedar trees, just as a thick, unnatural mountain fog began to roll in from the coast. The silence that accompanied the fog was absolute and deeply unsettling. Every single bird, insect, and nocturnal animal went completely dead silent, leaving nothing but the sound of my own heavy breathing and the oppressive, damp weight of the air pressing down on my eardrums. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As I sat inside my tent, trying to cook a simple meal on my camp stove, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began echoing from the dark woods outside, followed by the distinct sound of heavy, bipedal footsteps circling the perimeter of my campsite, crushing thick branches and snapping twigs with immense force. The sheer weight of the footsteps suggested something massive, far larger than any human or known predator. I grabbed my hunting knife and a high-powered tactical flashlight, stepping out into the freezing mist to confront what I assumed was a stray bear or a rogue hiker. But when I illuminated the tree line, the light beam caught a towering, 9-foot-tall entity woven entirely out of decayed wood, long moss, and bleached animal bones, standing perfectly still between the ancient trunks. The creature had no face, only a large, polished elk skull for a head, and its impossibly long, multi-jointed arms hung down past its knees, ending in sharp, wooden talons that scraped against the bark of the trees with a sickening, clicking sound. Its eye sockets glowed with a faint, malevolent green embers that seemed to burn straight through my soul. Before I could even process the sheer impossibility of what I was looking at, the entity let out a deafening, metallic shriek that sounded like tearing sheet metal mixed with a human scream, and the surrounding forest instantly began to shift and warp, the trees moving and twisting in the fog to form a chaotic, labyrinthine maze that completely blocked my path back to the trail. The physical reality of the environment was rewriting itself before my eyes. In a blind panic, I dropped my flashlight and ran as fast as my legs could carry me through the dark brush, briars tearing at my clothes and face as I sprinted through the endless loop of identical trees, only to emerge hours later right back at the clearing where the rusted camper van had mysteriously materialized. The rusted door of the vehicle creaked open further, revealing a pitch-black interior that radiated a profound wave of malevolent energy, and a soft, weeping voice began to drift out from the darkness inside, calling out for help in the exact voice of my younger sister who was thousands of miles away in Chicago. I backed away in absolute horror, my boots splashing into the mud, realizing that the forest entity was utilizing my own deepest memories and fears against me as a psychological weapon. But as I turned to run again, the towering elk-skulled creature stepped out from the fog directly in front of me, its wooden talons reaching out to wrap around my chest with a crushing grip that shattered 3 of my ribs instantly. The physical pain was excruciating, a white-hot agony that made me gasp for air. But the psychological terror was far worse as the creature's hollow skull began to whisper dark, twisted secrets about my past directly into my mind, threatening to trap my soul within the dark woods forever if I didn't stop fighting. Desperate and fading fast, my vision swimming in darkness, I used my free right hand to pull my hunting knife from my belt and drove it deep into the center of the entity's skull, causing the creature to unleash another agonizing shriek as a thick, black fluid erupted from the wound, covering my hands in a burning, foul-smelling sap. The creature dropped me to the damp ground, stumbling backward into the dense fog, and the moment it vanished from sight, the entire forest seemed to collapse inward with a loud, rushing sound like a massive tidal wave. The trees spun violently, and the ground gave way beneath me. I lost consciousness from the immense pain and lack of air, waking up hours later under the bright morning sun, lying flat on my back in the middle of a crowded public picnic area near the park's main visitor center, surrounded by terrified tourists who had called for paramedics. The doctors treated me for severe fractured ribs, deep lacerations, and advanced exposure, but the authorities could never explain how I had managed to travel over 15 miles through impassable, dense wilderness overnight while completely unconscious. I lost consciousness instantly, and when my eyes finally fluttered open, I was lying face down in the middle of the empty, rain-slicked Route 66 highway at dawn, my car parked perfectly on the shoulder, just 50 yards away with the engine idling smoothly, as if nothing had happened. I staggered to my feet, bruised, bleeding, and deeply traumatized, looking back toward where the motel should have been, only to find nothing but a vast, empty expanse of desert sand and a rusted, bullet-ridden sign from a business that had burned down to the ground in 1982. The local sheriff's office later told me that dozens of travelers had gone missing along that exact stretch of highway over the last 40 years, with no cars or bodies ever recovered. To this day, I still bear 5 faint, symmetrical white scars wrapped around my throat where the entity gripped me, a permanent, terrifying reminder that some travel destinations exist entirely outside the realm of the living, waiting to snare unsuspecting drivers who pull off the road in the dead of night. A low, wet whisper rasping directly into my right ear from the empty space beneath my pillow, revealing a dark childhood secret that absolutely no living person could possibly know, was the precise instant I realized the historic Savannah bed and breakfast room I had rented wasn't just haunted, it was actively trying to consume my sanity. My name is Beckett Hayes, and this terrifying supernatural encounter took place during a historic sightseeing trip to Savannah, Georgia, a city world-renowned for its beautiful antebellum architecture and its deeply sinister history of ghost stories and unexplained phenomena. I had booked room 303 at a beautifully restored 19th century bed and breakfast located right in the heart of the historic district, drawn in by the antique charm of the old brick walls, the sweeping velvet curtains, and a massive 4-poster canopy bed that dominated the center of the hardwood floor. The trouble began almost immediately after the sun set beneath the horizon, when a thick, suffocating heaviness settled over the room, making it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath, and the ambient lighting from the street lamps outside began to warp into long, distorted shadows that didn't align with any of the furniture in the space. The air felt charged with an oppressive electrical current, and the silence in the room was so deep that it made my ears ring. I tried to dismiss it as jet lag and exhaustion, climbing into the massive bed and turning off the bedside lamps, hoping that a solid night's sleep would clear my mind of the growing, irrational sense of paranoia that was clawing at my chest. Around 3:33 a.m., I was abruptly jolted awake by the distinct, freezing sensation of something solid and heavy pressing down on the center of my chest, completely pinning my body to the mattress and rendering me entirely unable to move a single finger or even cry out for assistance. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my lungs refused to expand under the invisible weight. My eyes scanned the dark room in a frantic search for the source of the pressure, and to my absolute horror, I watched as the ambient shadows mounted on the far wall slowly detached themselves from the plaster, crawling along the ceiling like massive, multi-legged insects before descending down the wooden posts of the bed toward where I lay helpless. The shadows coalesced directly above my face, forming a shifting, featureless silhouette of a weeping woman whose face was entirely replaced by a swirling vortex of black smoke that radiated a wave of absolute, freezing malice. The low, wet whisper began to echo directly inside my skull, repeating the exact date and time of a tragic accident from my childhood that I had never spoken about to anyone, followed by a cruel, echoing laughter that sounded like shattered glass scraping against the concrete floor. The shadow entity slowly reached down with its elongated, smoke-like fingers, pressing them firmly over my nose and mouth to cut off my breathing entirely. The sensation feeling exactly like inhaling freezing cold liquid mercury that burned my throat and lungs with intense physical agony. My vision began to blur into dark vignettes as my brain starved for oxygen, my limbs twitching weakly against the invisible bonds. Through the sheer primal terror of the situation, a surge of pure adrenaline allowed me to break through the physical restraint of the entity, violently yanking my head to the side and throwing my entire body weight out of the bed, crashing hard onto the hardwood floor below. The moment I broke contact with the mattress, the shadow entity dissolved into the darkness of the ceiling with a loud, angry hiss, but the true nightmare was far from over because the room began to expand and distort, the walls stretching away into an infinite corridor of dark brick. The door to the hallway was completely jammed from the outside, the brass handle burning my skin with an intense, freezing cold when I tried to turn in a state of sheer panic. The room began to shake violently as if caught in a severe localized earthquake, the antique paintings flying off the walls and shattering on the floor, while the velvet curtains caught fire with an invisible, heatless green flame that consumed the fabric in seconds. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture on my skin turned to frost. Desperate to escape the shifting trap, I grabbed a heavy wooden chair and threw it headfirst against the heavy glass of the historic window, shattering the frame and tumbling out onto the cast iron fire escape balcony, just as the entire interior of room 303 was completely swallowed by a massive, roaring vortex of absolute blackness. I scrambled down the metal stairs into the safety of the well-lit street below, bleeding from my hands and face, screaming for the night manager who ran out of the lobby in total shock at my frantic state. The subsequent police investigation of the room revealed no fire damage, no broken paintings, and no structural anomalies whatsoever. The room was perfectly neat and tidy, as if no one had slept in it. However, the bedsheets were completely soaked through with a freezing, foul-smelling water that smelled intensely of stagnant river mud and old decay, and the pillow was covered in dark, black handprints that faded away within hours. I packed my bags and left Savannah that very morning, but the true horror has never truly left me because every single time I close my eyes to sleep in a dark room, I can still feel that freezing weight pressing down on my chest and that low, wet whisper waiting under my pillow to pull me back into the dark.